to start anyone. Alright, so this is the main outline of what I'm going to be covering. So I'm going to spend about 15 minutes on this first thing, and 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there, and allow for 5-minute questioning as is the custom around these parts. So let's start with part 1. Freud, Jung, and I could say me. This is the abstract, which you all have seen, I'm sure. And so basically going to be looking at the earliest signs of mankind's interest in the unknown and the motivation for exploring it, and so on and so forth. And let's go ahead and start with this. Who am I? Well, I have my LinkedIn page here, and we're going to go over each section. And no, it's not really that important, but this is a sort of an org chart showing exactly the inputs and outputs of the machine, or something like that you could call me. So inputs, grew up in the United States, all that implies from its the different iterations of Western civilization. You can see Britain over there, the British Empire before that, the Romans before that, the Macedonians before that, the Athenians and the Delian League before that. You know, we can talk about the Minoan period, and then up there you can see basically the era in which Crete actually ruled a lot of the Western world. Catholic side, of course, you can see that springs from Judaic and Athenian values from ancient times, and that's internal family systems therapy, which is actually a thing that I underwent over the course of a year, which was really interesting and helped to really weed out a lot of the trauma that I'm sure any of you would have experience with, as we are all people, which is my PSA for therapy and whatnot. So output, you can sort of see private sector stuff that I'm sort of involved in. This is a logo right here for Combest Creatives, and I produced a show called Classics with Combest that shows classical literature. Combest Comics, which is a sort of a short publication of this character called the Math Man, and this main character called the Target and stuff like that. Primedian Saga, which is a fantasy genre thing, and the Combest Calendar, which is basically just an update of some of the things that I do. Public-wise, some may be familiar, I'm Catholic, of course, Sooner Catholic, and the SGA Congress. And all of these three under here are under that, and I'm involved with Knights of Columbus, the Mystic Institute, which is the theological sort of front that I come from, and this is the OU Math Club, why you all are here at this moment, or one of the reasons. I don't know how to speak to all of the reasons. You're crazy people. That's what it is. Oh, you just agreed. Okay. No. Good to see you. Yeah, you're welcome to any amount of pizza that you really want, as long as it's not, you grab the box and run sort of thing. But and so that's the basis of who I am. And but here's the important question: what information do I possess that is relevant to this talk? Well, I've done some reading in regards to these different perspectives by which you can look at reality. Form of action, place of things. Form of action, that's mainly concerned with morality and stuff like that, and is the concern of a lot of the humanities. There we go. Yeah. And so, what I've done there, in primarily Western canon, you can go ahead and look at that, and you see some references to early Mesopotamian mythology, the first polytheistic mythology that we really have on record, all the way up to Aristotle's works on logic, which I happen to complete mostly over winter break. Before the semester began, I was kind of running into it as this semester was going, and so I sort of had to hurry up on that, and real moment there. And then Jungian psychology, after meeting by Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. He's sort of become a very popular political figure as of late, but this textbook of his is putting that aside, that textbook of his is a remarkable work, and I think does real credit to the Jungian vein of thought. And you can see all of the different works that I read, including those who have been inspired by him and are directly connected to him in his studies. William McGilchrist and Eric Neumann, of course, them coming from different universities and different sects, but all of them sort of having a Jungian bent to them. And we'll see what I mean by Jungian as we get further along in this lecture. So, primarily 20th century, you can just sort of see all the authors there, it's a lot of big names and whatnot. And then we have the contemporary stuff, which informs a lot of my understanding of these modern times. Now, looking at the place of things side of things, some of the foundational stuff that I've looked at as far as mathematics is concerned comes from category theory for programmers by Bartosz Milewski and axiomatic set theory by Patrick Soubise. Both of them incredibly smart gentlemen, and my understanding of algebra, of course, comes from some of the things that you all have or may have experienced within your own undergraduate period. So, elementary number theory by William Stein, and you can basically read that in Contemporary Abstract Algebra by Gallian, Linear Algebra done right, Abstract Algebra by Dummett and Foote for a bit. And as far as my understanding of analysis is concerned, a lot less. So the understanding analysis and whatnot by Stephen Abbott, and complex analysis by Lars offers primarily topology, even less. So I need to beef up on that. But on the applied side, I have a bit more experience. So that's basically the retinue of stuff that I'm working with from there. So moving on, the view of reality as place of things is overt in consequence. But what are the form of action, right? So you have a ball, you throw it, you can pretty much calculate its trajectory and everything like that if you have enough information. Form of action, though, what's the consequence of that? I was talking to a guy, he was a real smart lad, economics, master's, whenever I used to attend this thing called Sunday Supper out at my church community. And he was like, that's all basically bullshit, which is what he said, word for word. But I used a different argument, a less gentle argument than the one that I'm making here. Let's go into it. So this is actually one of the best ways of sort of seeing the form of action gratified in its importance. And it comes from actually a fantasy author by the name of Terry Pratchett. His novels went on to inspire a lot of things. This World Series, and Neil Gaiman has a few shows, and they're directly tied to Terry Pratchett. You don't get Neil Gaiman, you don't get Brandon Sanderson, and all of the modern fantasy writers, I think, unless you go back to Terry Pratchett. He says, through his Grim Reaper in the Hogfather, a book that he wrote, take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder, conceive it through the finest seed, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy, and yet, death waved a hand, and yet you act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged. All horrifying things, which occurred just within the last 20th century. Are we to say simply that these things are on a moral equivalent with feeding bread to the homeless, and that sort of thing? Are we to say that these are on a moral equal playing field with donating to charity, maybe curing cancer? I would argue not. And you can see sort of a lot of the things just within the 20th century that went to inspire Carl Jung, who will come up later. Let's start with the study of the soul in psychology. From Greek psyche and Greek logia, study of. Sigmund Freud, 1856, 1939. We all know him because of the jokes, you say one thing when you actually mean your mother. Evidence? No. Okay, so I put in my abstract that we were primarily interested in Jungian motivation factor, the prime motivating factor. Freud postulates that most of the problems with the psyche emerge from the sexual part of the unconscious. And what's the evidence for that? You can sort of see that in a lot of things, really. And but Jung had a different idea. His idea was he postulated that everything relied on a religious framework. And I'm defining religious, and you're going to see ritual here pretty soon in a very specific way. So what's the evidence for this? Well, now we move on to part 2, which is rituals in animals. So what is a ritual? What do I define a ritual as? a way of doing something in which Cambridge Dictionary, by the way, I'm going to put like the etymology, connections to Latin and stuff like that up there. A way of doing something in which the same actions are done in the same way every single time, a fixed set of actions and words, especially as a part of a religious ceremony. So, the case for chimpanzee religion. And this is all going to, bear with me, this is all going to connect to math pretty soon. Well, this is part 2. Yeah, and so chimpanzees, in this article published by James B. Herrick, listed a number of religious behaviors, ritual-wise. So, did I show that? Did I show what I meant by? Okay, I'm just going to use the word ritual then, since I haven't defined it yet. So basically, you have trans-species definitions of reverence, careful observation, wonder, dread, communion, empathetic intimacy, and you can see he's charted this right here for all of the things which can be connected to these different rituals, these different states of these processes and whatnot that you could go into over and over again. So there's a lot to be said about that, and then the way that they interact with one another and whatnot. And yeah, so that was one of the earlier works. That's sort of the more fundamental stuff. And then you can actually see ritualistic stuff in elephants, and yeah, elephants in terms of like the way that they respect their dead and whatnot, and the fact that they actually try to bury them. And yeah, and even in crows. Crows have funerals of a sort in which they all sort of gather around a body. And this study right here maps that to a framework of basically an evolutionary basis where he's like, the crows are trying to determine what exactly killed this thing. So that way they won't run into the same thing. And there's a lot more on the topic of ritualistic behaviors in animals. So I'll go on to 2 more, and then I'll proceed with the lecture. So, chimpanzee accumulative stone throwing. So this is actually a rather recent phenomenon in which we've looked at chimpanzees across multiple sites here in Africa. And one of the things that we found is just they'll do this random thing, and it's not really connected to anything that we really know yet, but they'll take these stones from everywhere and they'll just sort of toss them into a tree. And it's like, we can describe it in terms of an algorithm. They pick up the rock and then they'll do all this sort of stuff. They'll hoot and then they'll throw the stone, bang, hurl, toss, and result, wait, listen, display, continue traveling. So, yeah, and this is a pretty neat thing right here, I thought, because I come from a computer science background, and this is just a nice diagram. And basically what I sort of thought whenever I first saw that was a reference to Skinnerian operant conditioning, done one of the early psychological experiments, superstition in pigeons, where basic setup is, you have a key, red, green, food hopper, and basically the sequences of the red and green, and then would indicate when exactly a pigeon was supposed to, on effect, press that button, get food. And what's interesting is how the pigeons will actually continue on that behavior long after the actual food has been gone. And so one of the things that I thought about is the way that the chimpanzees are sort of responding to these trees is in a very similar way to the way a pigeon might interact with red, green, and key. So, and how does this exactly connect to human beings? Well, there's actually an interesting thing that's sort of cross-species. Mammals, amphibians, fish, birds, reptiles all interact with a dopaminergic system in some sense governing our motivation. Can lead to addictions and stuff like that, and so this actually comes from a study of them taking away the dopamine transporter in birds and reptiles and exactly seeing how they compensate. But I'm mainly just using this to show that the basic elements of our neurology factored in right here. And there was an interesting book by Charles Duhigg on the power of habit to see exactly how far this unconscious phenomena can go. And I remember one story from this book where a man had a significant portion of his brain missing and continued to play out most of what he did during the day in his house without having any conscious recollection of it. mainly using the rudimentary tools of a brain which wasn't all too there. Now, this connects rather closely to a study that we did on rats in the, around 1947 it began, by John V. Calhoun, in which he put these rats in a utopian society. He gave them all the food that they needed, all of the water, and basically allowed them to thrive, copulate as much as they wanted to. So if the prime motivation there was indeed the sexual instinct, as Freud had postulated, in terms of like just creatures with a potential unconscious or potential animal workings, then one might think that this thing would thrive. But what actually ended up happening is within three generations, you see indications of rat depression in terms of them not wanting to interact with other rats and whatnot, and them also maternal faculties of the female rats not taking care of their mice children, and also cannibalism was also another thing, and some rats would go away from the main rat sect to sort of, I don't know, maybe avoid the violence. Maybe they try to like isolate themselves in some sense, but all for naught, because in the end you wind up with that completely societal collapse of the rat utopia. A lot of scientists of the time would call it. It was basically a look at population density, but one of the things that sort of was gleaned from that is that maybe there's something else going on there. In relation to survival, what sort of ritual practices would you engage upon? You take care of your young and that sort of thing, and you certainly wouldn't eat one another if you had access to all of the food and the water that you could ask for. And one could probably postulate that a lot of it just comes down to straight boredom, but why? If you have all of your needs fulfilled, if the sexual factor is the prime motivating factor, then why? And so basically, they're just they're just rats after all. You don't see this reflected in human beings at all. It's not like we're a bunch of stupid rats, And of course, it's absolutely reflected in terms of Western civilization's fertility rate and death by drug usage, rates of depression and whatnot contributing to that factor. So this is the part where I get to the main coup de grace of this topic in terms of the lack of information. So cave paintings and consequences. So religare, Latin to bind, religio, Latin obligation, I misspelled that, bond, reverence, religion. So take a religion and basically anything that it can sort of relate to. Well, what it's made up of is these ritualistic practices and stuff like that you continue to do over and over and over again, and that's a bond, right? So, which you can get from the etymology. And so this is the evolutionary tree of religion, and we start all the way back here in 100,000 BCE. This was designed by Simon E. Davies. I messaged the guy, and he's a pretty good guy. He is actually working on version 3, and if you want to look him up, you can find him under Mythopia and whatnot. And this is his whole field. He's a religious studies expert, and this is what he does for a living. So, but yeah, you got all of these different branches and whatnot going to all these different places, and it might seem a bit trying to find some structural tendency in regards to this history, but the Jungian God image, Jung would say that in each of these religions, in each of these bonds, in each of these collections of rituals, there lies this thing which he termed the God image, which I kind of put in quotes, the great provider, which is basically, take anything that you would consider transcendent that holds you to any morality, superficial or otherwise. you know, you could put God in there, you could put Brahman, you could put yourself, you could put the government, you could put reality, you could put the pantheon, and so on and so forth. You could put the party in 1984, you know, and so that's one of the things there. And so basically, what you could do with that framework in mind is you could actually match this to sort of collectively represent what goes on from hundreds of thousands of years ago to the current age. So animism are rituals surrounding inanimate, tangible objects in a sense, animating the inanimate. Anima, of course, relating to the soul. So does psyche in the sense of the breath of life, but we're not using the Latin thesaurus. So shamanism, rituals surrounding acts of a shaman to access the intangible spiritual world. Polytheism, rituals surrounding deities who may or may not interact on both the tangible and intangible planes of existence. Monotheism, rituals surrounding deity who may or may not interact on the tangible and intangible planes of existence. And you can see here I have a list of examples relating to each of these and with accompanying articles which I find rather interesting. So this one will talk about one of the first signs that we actually have of early human life actually caring about their dead and putting them in graves and stuff like that, along with these little items. So it's pretty interesting. 30,000 years ago, symbolic artifacts accompanying the burying of the dead, fertility idols. So, and for those of you that have read Moby Dick, the main character, well, one of the main, no, he's not the protagonist, but he's the main friend of the protagonist. His name is Queequeg. He has this little idol that he sort of carries around throughout the novel. And it's basically not a fertility idol. It's talking about Moby Dick, and I'm supposed to be focusing on this. 14,000 years ago, Mesopotamian, including Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, Indus Valley, etc., polytheistic religion, and some of the early Vedic texts, for those of you that might know something about Hinduism, they come from around this time period. And then about 3,000 years ago, if you read Plato's Timaeus, you'll find the Platonic demiurge, which he sort of there's like different aspects of what the one god might be. You know, there's like sort of the clockwork maker, which, you know, a lot of the deists sort of connect to, and this is what the Platonic demiurge is kind of like, because he creates the world and everything and whatnot. And the Vedic Brahman, that's a different one. That one's more complex. And then there was the Judaic transfer from monolatry, Elohist to Yahwist, which is basically, monolatry is basically, you have one God, but there's like a whole bunch of other gods, but we're going to value this one above the rest. And then like transferring that to Yahwist, which is like, no, there's only one God, all of the other ones are fake, this is the one God, you know. And then the Christian God and pantheism of Spinoza, Albert Einstein, one of the things that he'd say anytime anybody asked him, do you believe in God? He'd say, I believe in the God of Spinoza. Well, what does that mean? Pantheism is essentially the idea that all of reality, all, pan, you know, that's God, the universe, you know. And some, like including Nikola Tesla, would say that the physical underpinnings of the universe, those things are the closest thing that I have to a God, you know. And you see that with like Carl Sagan as well. And so let's go back to the first start of, that's a redundancy. Let's go back to the start of polytheism, and let's scroll back to 17,000 years ago, and where some of the first cave paintings that we have nowadays are available even to the public eye. And one of the things that you'll notice with the I'm going to butcher the pronunciations. Laco's Great Hall of the Bulls, recreated in this precise replica here, is these different points and whatnot that are connected to certain star formations that some have pointed out. Now, it is just a theory insofar as these different points are concerned. However, you have to understand that the sky that the ancients and everybody basically before us we're looking at is far different from the sky that we're looking at now. I'm sure most of you have heard of the concept of light pollution and whatnot, and what exactly you give up for the lighting of cities in terms of looking at the skies. And so Vincent van Gogh actually captures that aspect of how wild and crazy the sky looks at night. And it's so this guy is so crazy, and then people were so fascinated by it that you'd have this entire sect of varying pantheons reflecting what they thought of the sky. You could even make your own YouTube series on that topic, which you might want to look at now. But yeah, and so how exactly do we get from here to there, right? How exactly do we get from this, this religious instinct to a map of philosophy? Well, one of the things I sort of discovered looking at this, epistemology, value theory, metaphysics, history and traditions of philosophy, and then logic there in the center, which we're going to be focusing on here primarily, is how closely these things relate to words that we would have over religion, and you could get to the philosophy of religion, and it's its whole thing. But basically, epistemology, what is that? It's like studying, in a basic sense, how do we know what we know? Episteme. Metaphysics, after physics. Aristotle has a word called metaphysics. Basically means after physics. What's that? Well, how exactly did everything come to be? What are the foundations of reality? You could sort of connect that. And then ontology is within that, and that goes even deeper. But history and traditions, how exactly do we keep record of all of this stuff? And you have some people in our era right there. There's Bertrand Russell. He comes up. He was actually a mathematician philosopher. Yeah, and value theory, exactly how do we judge right from wrong? That sort of stuff. But there in the center of this map, which is actually, there's the website you can actually go to. It's a very good map. I actually have one in my office looking right directly over. And so you have informal logic, and then you have all of the rest of the stuff, which you have informal logic, which mainly deals with things like argument theory and stuff like that. So things that you would encounter in political debate, and stuff that you'd write in history, and stuff that you'd write in literature and various sorts. And you could sort of oh yeah, by the way, whenever I'm talking about these generalities, one should not assume that they are entirely an inseparable thing. For instance, if you get into some of the upper echelons of pure mathematics, you'll see the intertwining of algebra with analysis and topology and whatnot. You'll get all of these things which are sort of mixed together. So informal logic, that's what I see it mainly as being concerned with. Formal logic, that's sort of a propositional based thing. So if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Syllogism. Simple stuff. So, logic. What exactly is logic? What exactly is reason? And as far as I can parse out from the Greek, logikos, the logos, it's a big one in Christian theology, of or pertaining to speech or reasoning, rational, reasonable, instrument of reason, tool by which we sort of separate, ration out, divide order from chaos. Well, what exactly does that mean? Chaos is a very flimsy thing. Basically the information that you have, and you can organize in such structures separated from those that you can't. So, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, you have formal and informal logic, and this is sort of argument terminology and all of the stuff that's involved there, and you can make deductive arguments and stuff like that, stuff that you don't really encounter under formal logic. And then of course you have all of the biases and stuff that I have listed there, which you can go check those out if you ever get the time. They're pretty fun to play around with, and you can sort of look at the news and see exactly how many biases. You can make a drinking game, how many biases does a politician have within the space of an hour, and I trust you'll probably die. But yeah, and so you see all these authors and stuff underneath that, and then here's where we're mainly concerned. And this guy, by the way, has the guy that made this map of mathematics. He has a YouTube channel. I don't know if any of you all are familiar with Dominic Walliam. And basically he's a quantum physicist. And I know that's a big term because there's a lot that you could put under the umbrella of quantum, of course. But he's a physicist that's mainly concerned with the quantum stuff. insofar as I can construe any articulation on the point. And he makes these maps of what he sees in these different STEM-related fields, and I find them relatively accurate when I map them to exactly what the University of Oklahoma has to offer and some of the other universities in the area. Because what I'll do is I'll actually look at the course descriptions from various universities and I'll be like, you know, is it all baloney? You know, it's like the OU map is just like all made up, and then like the rest of it is kind of, you know. But yeah, so one of the things that I realized is that some of the things that we get from this, from pure math as it relates to the applied stuff, is so we get this sort of motivation from the stars to begin with, right? And then what exactly leads us to what exactly is the road to mathematics in that sense? Well, you have people like Archimedes and Plato and Aristotle all looking at some way to determine calculations of certain circles and whatnot from projections of shadows and whatnot as they relate to the sun's movement in relation to the earth, and you get people actually looking at celestial bodies, calling them gods and whatnot. And so that's a connection to some of the origins that we're looking at there. Yeah, and so what we basically have from that early seed of motivation, that looking to the stars, if you will, is this whole framework from which we derive our understanding of structures, spaces, changes, you know, and what comes to be known as these big three areas of algebra, topology, and analysis. And all of these three have their foundational equivalents, if you want to look into them more: metalogic, category theory, and set theory. Some people say all of those are too general. Some would agree. But they are interesting in their own right. And from this sort of, from the spawn of that motivation, we get two emerging ways of looking at the world. The way of the sort of formal sciences and the empirical sciences. Formal science, you know, it has logic, mathematics, statistics, and whatnot, and computer science. What is a formal science? A formal science is derived from a formal system. A formal system relies on propositions and whatnot, and all of those foundational goodies that we had there. And I shouldn't say relies exclusively, because we'll get into why that's not so here in a moment. Yeah, and so the empirical sciences. Empirical meaning, of course, those things which you can see and interact with in a sense. You don't necessarily see a light particle or wave, you know, exactly. But we have measuring instruments to do that. You don't see exactly things that interact on a quantum level. You can't see the strings in string theory. And heck, a lot of the things that we're lacking in string theory rely on, well, we need more empirical data on that topic from what I hear. These things. Computer science, what I've noticed is like the structures are fundamentally discrete in relation to, like, you know, ones and zeros, of course, stuff like that. The space that you can go from binary to compiler to, of course, even the most rudimentary of computing languages. And physics, of course, it relies on a lot of things that are continuous. And like I said earlier, these generalizations of things, these are not just one and only. It's going to be this forever and always. It's more like, this appears to be the general trend of things that I see here. So let's move on to exactly one of the things that I sort of found, you know, all of the, you know, going back to early cavemen looking at the stars and charting out these little clusters on there, sort of, you know, imagine how much dedication that would take. You know, that fascination with the stars, and everybody's like going back to Vincent van Gogh, it's chart of starry night. You get this focus on the sky. Eventually, this leads to something pretty phenomenal. A tale of two calculi. And the reason why I say two is because you have these two modes of looking at the sciences which manifest themselves right here, concretely. Isaac Newton, what he does is he looks at these physical phenomena, and from there he draws upon existing mathematics. He creates a new language around what he observes. Leibniz, though, it's So you have Newton interacting with the things down here, builds stuff up. Calculus as a language builds stuff up. That gets implemented into analysis and whatnot. Also the geometry of the time. Leibniz, opposite. Leibniz, what he does is he examines the work of Euclid's elements and stuff like that, and Kepler and whatnot. And he takes all of that existing framework, all of that existing stuff that's been looked at rigorously, and he's like, well, if it's that way, then if I proceed along a sequence of rational steps, it should be so. Integral calculus. And so there's these two different ways. He doesn't look at the little minute details. He looks at the general thing. Of course, he's looking at some details, right? But again, he's looking at these things from the perspective of a mathematician, philosopher, and then working his way down to see some sort of potential physical consequence. Versus Newton, who looks at the physical consequence and says there must be something existing in the theory that I can use as a framework here. So essentially, you get from physics to mathematics, from mathematics to physics. And so from there, from this look at the stars from the very beginning, from looking at all of these individual aspects, from looking and simply being according to these modes of thought, these procedures and whatnot, we land on the moon. And so I'll leave you with a final question here. Are you more of an engineer with a philosophy, or more a philosopher who engineers? And depending on how you answer that, neither one I think is more right than the other one, and we need physicists as much as we need mathematicians. We need engineers as much as we need philosophers. And depending on how you answer this, it could help in how you answer some of the bigger questions. And with that, I'm going to leave that there and move on to part 4 here with questions. Anybody have any questions? Okay, that's pretty good. Excellent. Yes. Thank you all so much for coming. It has been a delight to present this topic to you. I hope you found it informative. I certainly did, putting it together. And yeah, I hope that as you go on to explore whatever it is you explore, that it resorts in the best that humanity has to offer. Thank you.